Welcome back to this tutorial on the financial reasons to manage health and safety. And this is a common area of exam questions, and some very easy exam questions too. You could be asked a few different things here. You could be asked, well, what are the financial arguments to improve health and safety in this organization? I say this organization. Remember, it's all based on the scenario. You could be asked, what are the possible insured costs, the possible uninsured costs, and so on. And most of these questions can be very easily answered thanks to your course materials. But remember, you always must link your answer to what's going on in the scenario. Irrelevant information from the course materials, irrelevant to the scenario, will not get you any marks. Everything has to be relevant and linked to that scenario. So essentially, what we're going to say here is that, generally speaking, there are some general financial arguments here. Health and safety incidents cost money, and they cost a lot more money than it would cost to prevent them. So it's cheaper to prevent a health and safety incident from happening than it is to fix it after it has happened. We've already talked about morality and society's expectations and so on, and later we're going to talk about law, but there are lots of costs associated with society and law. So we'll look at the legal costs in a moment and the costs of damaging your reputation with society. But once you include all of the costs, both the visible costs and what we call the hidden costs, you will find that the costs of poor health and safety management are just enormous. But many of those costs are very difficult to quantify because they are hidden. And so we're going to look at some of those costs right here. Now, if we take a look at this slide, what you'll see, we've got the traditional iceberg analogy. You see there's an iceberg floating in the ocean there. And what does this represent? Well, it represents that some of the costs, a small proportion of the costs, are visible. They are above the water and we can see them. But many of the costs are hidden. Most of the iceberg is hidden under the water. You can't see it. You can see an iceberg over there somewhere and you think, oh, I'm a long way away from the iceberg, it's okay. Yes, but what you don't know is that the iceberg underneath the water is huge and you are, bang, you're right next to it. It's the Titanic all over again. According to the HSE, and the HSE are the UK's health and safety regulator, the enforcement agency, the government enforcement agency. HSE stands for Health and Safety Executive. The HSE have calculated that the uninsured costs, so the costs which have no insurance to cover them, they are between 8 to 36 times greater than the insured costs. Now, when I say insured, what I mean is that there is an insurance policy to pay that cost. And there are different kinds of insurance policies. Now, you don't need to know this for your exam, but you do need to understand what I'm talking about here. So examples of insurance might include employer's liability insurance. So an employer's liability insurance pays for the costs of compensation. So if a worker were to get injured and sue the organization for their injury to get some money to compensate them, usually not the employer that pays that compensation, it would be the insurer. Here in the UK, it is a legal requirement for most employers to have that insurance, but outside of the UK, places like Africa and the Middle East and Asia, for example, South America, the laws might be different, and so many organizations do not have that type of insurance. If you're watching this and you're a NEBOSH student, did you know that you have a ton of resources on the Compassa website which you can use? Many of them are very, very cheap. You've got our YouTube section here, loads of free advice here, but if you want some study books, if you want exam technique documents, exam technique guides, instructions on how to do your NG2 or IG2 practical project, you can download those at some very, very reasonable prices from our website. And if you wanted hands-on tutor support with full access to all of our tutorials, guides, me and my colleagues at the tips of your fingers, consider signing up for our NEBOSH Rescue package. You'll get access to our full course and tutor support at a heavily discounted rate. And, well, frankly, you'll struggle to find pass rates that are as consistently high anywhere else. Let's get back to the advice. Let's take a look at what some of these insured costs are. So the insured costs, and again, it depends on the organization and it depends on what insurance they have, but the insurance is usually limited to compensation to workers and to the public. So if they were to sue you for financial compensation after an injury, the employer's liability insurance or the public liability insurance would pay that compensation. And they would also pay the legal defense costs, for example, if it went to court. Now, most of those compensation claims, certainly in the UK and Europe, most of them never get to court, because what happens is that the insurance company settles. So they try and negotiate a financial agreement with the person to avoid going to court, and that is cheaper than paying lawyers to go to court to fight it out. So that is usually paid for by the insurer. In some cases, we also have damage to equipment and damage to buildings. And so for example, you might have a fire, and if the organization has building insurance, which covers fire, then the fire insurer, the building insurer, would pay to repair the building or rebuild that building. Sometimes equipment is insured as well. Certainly cars. Yeah, so if you have a car driving on the road, there's a good chance you have insurance. If someone were to crash the car or crash the lorry, the truck that is driving on the road, then the insurance would normally pay for the repairs to that. But most costs are hidden. Most costs are uninsured. Most costs are very difficult to quantify. Let's start with this. Let's do a preliminary exercise to see if you can work this out. Please try to sort out the insured costs from the uninsured costs. Well, as you can tell there, most of those costs are uninsured. You knew what the insured ones were, but most were uninsured. Here's the list of uninsured costs. This is a list which might be very useful to you on your exam day. If you were asked what are the possible uninsured costs to the organization of the incident or poor health and safety generally, these are some of the costs. Of course, don't just copy this list and dump it in your exam answer. There won't be any marks for that. You have to take these costs and relate them to the scenario. So it has to be relevant to the scenario, and you would probably have to explain how the organization in the scenario could incur these costs. What does it look like? Let's just go through some of these costs. So one of the first costs you're going to see if there's an accident is that it's going to cause an injury and a mess. So someone is hurt. And that means you're going to have first aid costs. A first aider is going to have to look after that person. So this person who's injured is not working. They are being paid to not work. They're now being paid to bleed on the floor. That's a waste of money. And we have a first aider who's now not really working. They are working, they're doing first aid, that is work, but they're not doing useful work for profit, are they? So their time doing medical treatment is salary. That's money, it's a cost. Now, let's say there's blood on the floor. Well, that blood on the floor is going to have to get cleaned up, isn't it? You've now got a mess, so a cleaner or somebody is going to have to clean that up. That's extra time, extra work, that's extra cost. Maybe blood went on the materials that were being made, or maybe it went on a computer, or it went on some machine or equipment. Maybe some things have to be thrown in the rubbish. If you're making, say, plasters or bandages, ironically, let's say someone cuts themselves in a clothing factory, or where blood gets on the clothing or the plasters or the bandages, whatever it is, and that's now contaminated, and that usually gets thrown in the rubbish. So that is, again, another cost. That's wasted materials, wasted product. Chances are, if it's a really serious accident, there are lots of people around who are all now looking and staring, oh my goodness, what happened? This is awful. All of that time is wasted and is a cost. And then a manager has to get involved and manage the situation, try and catch back production, put things back in order, and then they have to investigate. The manager's time is lost production. Can you see? Now, you can talk at length about lost production and lost time. Don't overdo the lost production arguments, because it really is just one cost. Lost time equals money. It's just one cost. Try and think more broadly to the other types of cost as well. So let's look at other types of cost. This injured person is now off sick at home. If your organization has a sick pay policy, and here in the UK, Europe, for example, we are required by law to pay workers to stay at home, maybe your organization does something like that, that sick pay being paid to them is wasted money. You're not getting any work in return for the sick pay, so that's a cost. The poor manager who has to sort all this out, so they still have to hit production targets and service targets, but now they've wasted a load of time, they're one person down. First aiders filling out some paperwork somewhere and refilling the first aider box. We have to catch back the time we've lost. And how do you do that? Well, you may have to pay people to work overtime. So at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, whenever the day ends, you are now asking people, oh, team, can you please work an extra 2 hours? And you may have to pay them extra money, full wage, or maybe even more than their full wage. Maybe they get 120% or 150% of their normal wage for those extra hours. Maybe you have to bring in temporary workers, agency workers, and agency workers cost money. So it's extra people, extra salaries, extra money. And then there's a load more wasted time with those people because those people need to be interviewed, selected, trained, supervised, and agency workers are inexperienced. And so they do need a lot of supervision. So that's extra work. Now imagine you're having lots and lots of these accidents quite regularly, or not just accidents, but maybe ill health conditions. And let's say workers are not very happy. So there's a morale problem here. Now morale is not a cost. Morale doesn't cost any money. Morale can affect your productivity. It can slow people down so they do less work for the same time. That could be a cost. Low morale can also lead to people leaving, higher staff turnover. They quit and they go work somewhere else, somewhere where the conditions are better and safer. And so if people are quitting, that means you have to hire replacements, which means job interviews, selecting the candidates, training these new people, supervising these new people. All of that is time and all of that is cost. And maybe your reputation is so bad that you have to pay people more money to work for you. I did have an employer who used to be like that. I had an employer who was so bad they had to pay people £5,000 more than the average in the area, because they had such a bad reputation for being such a bullying culture. So that is a direct financial cost. Now, let's say you've injured someone really very badly. You now might get investigated by your enforcement agency. We'll talk about your enforcement agencies later, but this enforcement agency could visit your site, again, wasting more of your valuable time, and they might decide to prosecute you. And so you then have to go to court, and you're in trouble. To defend you in court, you will need to pay lawyers. I say you, I don't mean you personally, I mean your employer here, your organization. The employer has to pay lawyers. They're very expensive. So there are legal costs, there are court costs. And at the end of all of that, you will probably lose. And so you will be fined. And the fines can be very, very large indeed. Here in the UK, the fines can be hundreds of thousands, millions of pounds. The fines are potentially unlimited here in the UK. The judge can set whatever fine they think is sufficient to punish the organisation for this crime. So very large fines as well. But that's not the end of it. The person who's injured may then sue you. And we talked about being sued earlier. We said the compensation is insured. But if you have an insurance policy to pay the compensation, who pays the insurer? Well, your organisation does, and it's very, very expensive. If you have too many compensation claims, your insurer will just increase the price of the insurance. They will increase the insurance premium, which means that you end up paying the compensation indirectly. And finally, well, all of this may become known to the public. Serious accidents will appear in the local newspapers. They will appear on social media. People will talk about them, and it may bring your organisation some very negative publicity, bad publicity. That is not necessarily a cost, but it is a cost when that bad publicity leads to fewer purchases, fewer people using your products or buying your services. So for example, there were some years ago a couple of very, very serious fires in Bangladesh. And these were fires in clothing factories where workers were working in some pretty horrible conditions. These factories were supplying a British shop called Primark. And after these fires happened, and in these fires, like dozens of people died in these fires, they were trapped inside the building, There were children who died, women who died. It was it was awful. This became known in the UK and people talked about it on social media, and they decided to boycott Primark. Primark saw its sales go down. So a shop in the United Kingdom saw its sales go down by a large percentage because of a major fire in Bangladesh. This was the power of social media. So it can result in lower levels of sales. Another different example might be if you work in construction, your clients may be selecting the construction contractors on the basis of quality, cost, but also safety performance. And if you've had a very serious incident, a prosecution, they may decide not to give you the contract. So those are the uninsured costs. Let's do a short exercise now to see if you can put the text into the right boxes. Well, my friend, I hope I will see you in the next tutorial.